When I stepped through the glass doors of Vertex Innovations as their newly appointed chief executive officer, I never expected to see my ex-husband's face turn ashen with shock. The same man who had ended our 12-year marriage with a cold text message while I was at my father's hospital bedside now stood frozen in the boardroom, realizing that the company's mysterious new leader, the one about to expose years of financial mismanagement, was the woman he had so callously discarded. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The September morning was unusually warm as I approached the sleek headquarters of Vertex Innovations. Sunlight glinted off the building's modern glass facade, creating a dazzling display that matched the fire of determination burning inside me. 3 years of meticulous planning had led to this moment. 3 years since that text message. 3 years of rebuilding myself from the shattered pieces Jason had left behind. I adjusted my tailored charcoal suit and took a deep breath. The security guard at the entrance smiled professionally as I approached. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" I returned his smile with practiced ease. "I'm Allison Carter. I have an appointment." The name still felt strange on my tongue. Allison Carter, not Allison Mitchell. The name I'd reverted to after Jason had decided our marriage wasn't worth even a face-to-face conversation. "Ah, yes, Ms. Carter." He checked his tablet. "You're expected upstairs. Let me print your visitor badge." I suppressed a smile at the irony. Visitor. According to the contract I'd signed 3 weeks ago after extensive negotiations with the board, I was the new chief executive officer of Vertex Innovations, one of the country's fastest-growing tech firms in the same company where Jason had built his career, while I supported him from the shadows. The security guard handed me the temporary badge. "This will get you through all the doors today. HR will sort out your permanent credentials after the announcement." I clipped the badge to my lapel. "Thank you." As I stepped into the elevator, my heart began to pound. Not from nervousness, but from anticipation. When the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. At 42, I looked better than I had at 30. The pain of betrayal had forged me into someone stronger, more focused, more determined than the woman Jason had married all those years ago. The elevator ascended smoothly to the 35th floor, each floor bringing me closer to the culmination of my carefully orchestrated plan. 3 years ago, I had been nothing more than Jason's wife to the people in this building. Today, I would be their leader. When the doors opened, I was greeted by the hum of a busy executive floor. Through glass walls, I could see various department heads gathering for the morning briefing. Most of them wouldn't recognize me. Jason had always kept me separate from his professional life, insisting that mixing business and personal matters was inappropriate. How convenient that philosophy had been for him. I walked confidently toward the reception desk, where a young woman looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm Allison Carter. I believe I'm expected." Recognition flickered in her eyes, though she maintained her professional composure. "Of course, Ms. Carter. The board members are already inside. The announcement will begin at 10 a.m. I glanced at my watch. 9:25 a.m. The official announcement of my appointment was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. "Is there somewhere I can wait until then?" "Of course. I can show you to a private office until the meeting begins." As she stood to escort me, the conference room door opened and several executives filed out. Jason emerged last, his attention fixed on a stack of papers in his hands. He looked older than when I'd last seen him. New lines around his eyes, a touch of gray at his temples. Success had aged him, or perhaps it was stress. The financial irregularities I'd uncovered would certainly give anyone reason to worry. I lowered my head slightly, turning toward the reception desk as if reviewing something. Not yet. The moment wasn't right. "Melissa," Jason called to the receptionist. Send these projections to the department heads and make sure everyone's ready for the big announcement at 10. The board's being very mysterious about this new CEO. My pulse quickened. He had no idea. Right away, Mr. Mitchell, Melissa responded, returning to her desk as Jason headed toward his corner office. She turned to me apologetically. I'm sorry about the delay, Ms. Carter. Let me show you to the waiting area. Actually, I said, an idea forming. Is that small office still available? The one near the conference room? I gestured toward what had once been a secondary meeting space, positioned with a clear view of Jason's office through the glass walls. Melissa looked surprised. You know the building layout? I smiled. I did my research. She led me to the small office where I settled in with a clear sight line to Jason's desk. Perfect. I opened my briefcase and removed a sleek leather portfolio containing the documents that would reshape Vertex Innovations forever. The files told a damning story. Systematically inflated revenue projections, misappropriated research funds, and questionable stock transactions, all carefully documented over the past 3 years. The board had been stunned when I presented my findings during our confidential meetings. The evidence had led directly to their unanimous decision to bring me in to clean the house. A decision made easier by my MBA in corporate finance and the reputation I'd built turning around troubled tech companies over the past 3 years. My phone vibrated with a text from Douglas Warner, the board chairman. Everything set for 10 a.m. The conference room is prepared. Are you ready? I smiled, remembering Douglas's expression when I'd first presented my evidence. The shock had quickly given way to calculated determination. Vertex's stock would take a hit when the irregularities eventually came to light, but with proper management and transparency, they could weather the storm. They needed someone with intimate knowledge of the situation, but untainted by the scandal. Someone with financial expertise and a personal stake in setting things right. They needed me. I texted back, ready in position? Through the glass, I watched Jason moving about his office, commanding attention on a phone call, gesturing emphatically with his free hand. Same expensive suit, same authoritative stance, same dismissive wave when an assistant tried to interrupt, him with what was likely important information. The next 30 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Executives and managers began filtering into the conference room. I noticed several board members arriving, their expressions carefully neutral as they nodded subtle acknowledgments in my direction when passing by the small office where I waited. At 9:55 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Douglas. We're ready for you, main conference room. I gathered my materials, took a deep breath, and stepped into the hallway. The moment 3 years in the making had arrived. As I approached the conference room, I could see Jason through the glass walls, sitting confidently at the table, one seat removed from the head position, the CEO's chair. He was chatting amiably with Rachel Hoffman from legal, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. Douglas met me at the door. Ms. Carter, welcome to Vertex Innovations. The room fell silent as heads turned toward me. Jason continued speaking to Rachel for a moment before registering the change in atmosphere. He looked up, his sentence trailing off as our eyes met for the first time in 3 years. Confusion clouded his features first, recognition without comprehension. What was his ex-wife doing here? Then the pieces began to connect as he noticed my position beside Douglas, the board chairman's hand on my shoulder, the deferential posture of other board members. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas began, his voice carrying the authority of his position. Before we make the formal announcement to the company, I wanted to personally introduce you to Vertex Innovations' new Chief Executive Officer, Allison Carter. Jason's face drained of color, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests of his chair. The visitor badge suddenly felt feather light against my lapel. Many of you may not know Ms. Carter, Douglas continued, but she brings exceptional qualifications to this position, With her background in corporate finance and her comprehensive understanding of Vertex's unique challenges, the board voted unanimously to bring her leadership to our company during this critical transition period. I stepped forward, placing my portfolio on the table as all eyes followed my movements. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and clear, the voice of someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. Thank you, Chairman Warner. I look forward to working with all of you as we address the significant issues facing Vertex Innovations and chart a course toward genuine transparency and sustainable growth. My gaze settled on Jason, who looked as though he might be sick. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Some of you might be wondering about my familiarity with Vertex's operations despite coming from outside the company. The subtle emphasis on outside wasn't lost on Jason, whose breathing had become visibly uneven. For those who don't know me, I continued, opening my portfolio to reveal the damning documentation. I was once Allison Mitchell, and I believe it's time we discuss the actual financial position of this company, starting with these irregularities in the quarterly reports. As I began distributing copies of the financial analysis, Jason's shock transformed into something darker, a cornered, desperate realization. In a single morning, he had lost not just his authority, but his carefully constructed facade. And the woman he had discarded like yesterday's trash now held the power to expose everything. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as understanding dawned on the faces around the table. This wasn't just a leadership change, it was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. The conference room had fallen so silent you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. I remained standing at the head of the table, watching as executives flipped through the pages of financial evidence I'd provided. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror as they absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. Jason sat frozen, his complexion ashen against his navy suit. The man who had once commanded every room he entered now seemed to be shrinking before my eyes. These numbers can't be accurate. Rachel from the legal team finally broke the silence, her voice strained. This would suggest systematic misrepresentation of our financial position for at least 2 years. 3 years, I corrected, maintaining my composure. The pattern begins subtly in 2020, but becomes increasingly bold by 2022. Note the discrepancy between reported R&D expenditures and actual fund allocation. Nearly $32 million rerouted through shell companies and listed as legitimate research costs. Douglas nodded grimly. The board has verified Ms. Carter's findings through an independent forensic accounting firm. The evidence is irrefutable. Jason's breathing had become shallow, visible in the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His eyes darted around the room, assessing allies, finding none. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a forced casualness that fooled no one. There's clearly some misunderstanding. These allocations were all approved through proper channels for special projects with confidential parameters. I met his gaze steadily. Are you referring to Project Pinnacle? The one registered to Westbrook Holdings, which, interestingly, shares a mailing address with your lake house in Vermont? A muscle twitches in his jaw. The lake house was purchased during our marriage but mysteriously excluded from our divorce settlement. I'd discovered its connection to Vertex's missing funds only after months of painstaking investigation. I think we should continue this discussion privately, Jason said, attempting to regain control of the situation. This is a complex matter with sensitive implications for the company. That's precisely why we're discussing it here, Douglas. I interjected firmly. Vertex Innovations has operated in the shadows for too long. The board has unanimously decided that transparency begins now, in this room, with these executives. I nodded my thanks to Douglas before continuing. To address the immediate concerns, yes, the company is in a precarious position. Yes, there will be legal and financial consequences. But with proper leadership and complete transparency, Vertex can weather this storm and emerge stronger. And you believe you're that leadership? Jason's voice dripped with sudden venom, his shock giving way to anger. A woman who's never run anything more complex than our household budget? Several executives shifted uncomfortably at his naked hostility. I allowed myself a small smile before responding. While you were building your career at Vertex, Jason, I wasn't just running our household budget. I was completing my MBA in corporate finance. I was building a consultancy specializing in financial forensics. And for the past 3 years, I've been turning around companies that faced far worse situations than Vertex's current predicament. I paused, letting this sink in. Throughout our marriage, Jason had dismissed my career aspirations, insisted that his work was enough for both of us. He'd never bothered to notice when I'd shifted from supporting his dreams to quietly building my own. Your most recent client being Intrepid Systems, Rachel said suddenly, recognition dawning on her face. You're the consultant who uncovered the embezzlement scheme that saved them from bankruptcy. She turned to the others. Intrepid's stock has doubled since they reorganized under her guidance. Jason's face contorted with disbelief. This is absurd. You can't possibly. The board didn't choose Ms. Carter despite her connection to you, Jason, Douglas cut in. We chose her because she has the unique combination of skills and intimate knowledge of Vertex that we need right now. The fact that you were once married is irrelevant to her qualifications. But we all knew that wasn't entirely true. My personal history with Jason had given me insights no outside consultant could have acquired, access to conversations, patterns, and details that had ultimately led me to unravel his financial deception. Now, I continued, returning to the matter at hand, let's discuss immediate action items. First, we need to prepare for controlled disclosure to the SEC. Second, we need to secure all financial records to prevent any unfortunate deletions. My eyes flicked meaningfully to Jason. And third, we need to restructure the executive team, effective immediately. Jason stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. This is a witch hunt. You have no right. I have every right, I replied calmly. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vertex Innovations, appointed by unanimous board decision. Your position as Chief Operating Officer now reports directly to me. The stunned silence that followed was broken only by the soft ping of an incoming email on multiple devices around the table. The official company-wide announcement of my appointment, precisely timed to arrive at 10:15 a.m. Jason's phone remained conspicuously silent. I'd instructed IT to delay his notification by 15 minutes, a small, perhaps petty victory, but satisfying nonetheless. This meeting will continue in 30 minutes, I announced, gathering my materials. I suggest you all take some time to review the documentation thoroughly. Jason, I'll need to see you in my office immediately. Your office? He repeated, voice hollow. Yes, I replied, gesturing toward the large corner office with sweeping city views. His office until approximately 10 minutes ago. Melissa has already begun transferring your personal items to your new space. As executives filed out, murmuring urgently among themselves, Jason remained rooted in place, his world visibly crumbling around him. When only Douglas and I remained with him in the conference room, his composure finally shattered. You manipulative, he hissed, leaning across the table. You engineered this whole thing for revenge. Douglas stepped forward, but I raised my hand slightly, stopping his intervention. This moment had been 3 years in the making, and I wouldn't be robbed of it. Revenge? I repeated softly. Is that what you think this is about? I gathered my portfolio and stood to my full height, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had once been my everything. The man who had ended 12 years of marriage with a text message while I stood at my father's hospital bedside. This isn't revenge, Jason. This is justice. For the shareholders you've defrauded, for the employees whose jobs you've endangered, for the company you were entrusted to protect. I paused, letting my words sink in. That it happens to bring you to your knees is merely poetic. As I walked out of the conference room toward what was now my office, I heard Douglas's voice behind me, cool and professional. "Mr. Mitchell, security will escort you to your new office. Please don't attempt to access any company servers or remove any documents from the premises." My visitor badge felt impossibly light against my lapel as I stepped into my new domain. Through the glass walls, I could see the office floor buzzing with the news of my appointment. Employees gathering in clusters, smartphones displaying my company headshot from the announcement email. Within 5 minutes, Douglas and Rachel arrived, both looking concerned about the developing situation. "Jason is spiraling," Rachel said without preamble. "He's threatening to call major clients and tell them to pull their contracts. He's already tried contacting Marcus Blackwell at Nexus Dynamics," Douglas added. "Fortunately, Marcus called me first. He was confused by Jason's claims that the company is being hijacked." I nodded, processing this information. Marcus Blackwell was Vertex's largest client, representing nearly 30% of annual revenue. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that we're undergoing a leadership transition and will brief him personally tomorrow. He's agreed to withhold judgment until then." "Good." I stood, gathering my tablet. "Let's deal with Jason now, before this gets any more public." As we walked to conference room B, employees quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to watch the unfolding drama. Their curiosity was understandable. In a single morning, the company's power structure had been completely upended. Jason was pacing the conference room when we entered, his tie loosened, hair disheveled. 2 security guards stood impassively by the door. When he saw me, his expression contorted with rage. "There she is!" he snarled. "The woman who orchestrated this entire coup!" "That's enough, Jason," Douglas said sharply. "Your behavior is inappropriate and unprofessional." "Unprofessional?" He laughed bitterly. "She's my ex-wife. This entire situation is inappropriate." "The board," Rachel interrupted, "made its decision based on Ms. Carter's qualifications and her evidence of your financial misconduct. Your personal history is irrelevant to that decision." Jason turned to me, his voice dropping dangerously. "You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? Our entire marriage. Was it just to get close to Vertex?" The absurdity of his accusation might have been comical if it weren't so offensive. We'd met in college, years before either of us had any connection to Vertex Innovations. "I think you're confused about the timeline, Jason," I replied calmly. "When we married, you were a junior analyst at Henderson Financial. Vertex wasn't in either of our futures then." "Then why?" His voice cracked slightly, genuine confusion breaking through his anger. "Why this company? Why now?" I considered my answer carefully, aware of Douglas and Rachel watching this exchange. "Because Vertex is where the evidence led me. The financial irregularities, the misappropriated funds, the tax avoidance schemes, all of it pointed here. That you happened to be at the center of it was coincidental. A partial truth. While my investigation had indeed been based on financial evidence, I'd started looking at Vertex specifically because of Jason. 3 months after our divorce, while still rebuilding my life, I'd noticed discrepancies in Vertex's public filings. Patterns, similar to cases I'd worked on professionally. Curiosity had become suspicion, and suspicion had evolved into the most thorough investigation of my career. "You have 2 options, Jason," I continued. "You can accept the position of VP of Special Projects with appropriate oversight, or you can resign effective immediately. Either way, you will cooperate fully with the independent audit and the SEC disclosure." "And if I refuse?" he challenged, stepping closer. "Then the board will terminate you for cause, and the evidence of financial misconduct will be included in your employment record." I kept my voice level. "Additionally, the full file will be turned over to the authorities for criminal investigation." The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. "You're threatening me with prison?" "I'm offering you a choice," I corrected. "More than you gave me when you ended our marriage via text message." Douglas shifted uncomfortably, and I realized I'd allowed personal history to seep into a professional conversation. I quickly redirected. The choice is yours, Jason, but it needs to be made now. The company announcement has gone out. The transition is happening with or without your cooperation. He stared at me for a long moment, calculating replacing rage in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice had regained its usual controlled timbre. I'll take the VP position. Temporarily. While I consider my options. I nodded, unsurprised. Jason had always been pragmatic when cornered. Wise choice. Melissa will brief you on your new responsibilities and limitations. For now, I suggest you go to your new office and gather yourself before the all-hands meeting at 3 p.m. As security escorted him out, I noticed the subtle change in his demeanor. The way his shoulders straightened, his expression smoothed into unreadable calm. The initial shock had worn off. The calculating Jason I knew so well was re-emerging, already plotting his next move. He's going to be a problem, Douglas murmured beside me. Yes, I agreed, but a managed problem is better than an unpredictable one. What I didn't share with Douglas was the dossier still in my briefcase, the evidence I hadn't yet presented to the board, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, in the Cayman Islands. The connections to questionable investors that went far beyond mere financial impropriety. Jason wasn't just a corrupt executive. He was the linchpin in a network that extended beyond Vertex's walls. And I had only begun to unravel the full extent of his operation. As we walked back toward the executive floor, Rachel cleared her throat uncomfortably. Allison, may I speak frankly? I nodded, curious about what the head of legal wanted to say. Personal history between you and Jason. It complicates things from a legal standpoint. If he decides to claim this is a personal vendetta, rather than corporate governance, he can claim whatever he wants, I interrupted smoothly. The evidence speaks for itself. 5 independent auditors have verified my findings. The board has unanimously approved my appointment. His accusations would be dismissed as the desperate attempts of a disgraced executive to deflect attention from his own misconduct. Rachel didn't seem entirely convinced. Still, perception matters, especially with the SEC and shareholders. Which is why, I added, I've compiled a comprehensive dossier on my own involvement, full disclosure of our past relationship, documentation of my investigation process, and independent verification of every finding. It's all there, Rachel. Transparency works both ways. This seemed to satisfy her, at least temporarily. As we reached my office, I paused, turning to both board members. Vertex Innovations is about to enter the most challenging period in its history, I said quietly. What happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether we emerge stronger or collapse under the weight of Jason's deceptions. I need to know you're both prepared for what's coming. Douglas's expression hardened with determination. We knew what we were getting into when we reviewed your evidence, Allison. The board stands behind you. I hoped that resolve would hold when the full scope of Jason's activities came to light. Because the financial fraud I'd presented was merely the tip of a much darker iceberg. One that, when exposed, would send shockwaves far beyond Vertex's walls. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of meetings, each one revealing new layers to Jason's web of corruption. At 2 p.m., I met with Catherine Maldonado from IT and the forensic accountants in a secure conference room we designated as our investigation hub. We've begun deep analysis of the server backups, Catherine reported, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she projected data onto the wall screen. Jason thought he was covering his tracks by deleting files from the main system, but he didn't realize we maintain encrypted backups on a separate server that even executives can't access. The lead forensic accountant, a stern woman named Elaine, Woodward, nodded appreciatively. Smart protocols. We've already identified at least 17 instances where original financial documents were altered before submission to the board or regulatory agencies. Show me, I requested, moving closer to the screen. Elaine pulled up side-by-side comparisons of quarterly reports, original versions versus the doctored files that had been officially submitted. The discrepancies were subtle but significant. Research funds reclassified, profit margins artificially inflated, compliance costs buried under vague administrative expenses. He was good, Elaine admitted grudgingly. Most of these manipulations would go unnoticed in standard audits. It's only when you look at the pattern across multiple quarters that the deception becomes apparent. Melissa entered the room carrying a thick folder. Ms. Carter, I found these in Mr. Mitchell's private files, the ones he kept in his personal safe rather than the company's secure document system. I accepted the folder with gloved hands, mindful of maintaining the chain of evidence. Inside were handwritten notes detailing meetings not recorded on Jason's official calendar, many with an individual identified only as TW, the same initials from the email exchanges I'd uncovered earlier. Catherine, can you cross-reference these dates with Jason's email communications with this TW contact? And check his building access logs for these days. See if any unregistered visitors came through security. As Catherine nodded and began typing, I continued reviewing the documents. One page caught my attention. A handwritten calculation of fund transfers between Vertex Innovations, Westbrook Holdings, and a third entity labeled Pinnacle Prime. The numbers were staggering. Over 90 million moved through this triangular structure in the past 2 years alone. Elaine, what do we know about Pinnacle Prime? I asked. The forensic accountant frowned. Nothing yet. It's not mentioned in any of the official company documents we've reviewed. A knock at the door interrupted us. Douglas entered, his expression grave. Allison, we may have a situation developing. Jason's been making calls from his personal cell phone since being escorted to his new office. We can't monitor the content, but the patterns are concerning. Who has he called? I asked immediately, alert. Several numbers were still identifying, but 2 stand out. Marcus Blackwell at Nexus Dynamics and someone at the private number for the Wall Street Journal's corporate investigative team. I processed this information quickly. He was trying to control the narrative, either by pressuring our largest client or by leaking a story that framed this transition as a personal vendetta. And there's more, Douglas continued. Security reports. He's scheduled a visitor for 4:30 p.m. today, a lawyer from Steinberg and Powell. They specialize in executive disputes and whistleblower cases. The pieces clicked into place. Jason was positioning himself as a whistleblower, a dedicated executive, being unfairly targeted by his vindictive ex-wife. It was clever. I had to acknowledge that. If he succeeded in controlling the narrative, he could undermine my credibility before the full extent of his corruption became public. We need to accelerate our timeline, I decided. Douglas, is the press release ready for the SEC disclosure? Almost. Legal is finalizing the language to ensure we're fully compliant while minimizing market panic. Send me the draft immediately. I want it issued before close of business today. I turned to Elaine. How quickly can your team compile a preliminary report on the financial discrepancies? We can have a top-line summary in 3 hours. It won't be comprehensive, but it will establish the pattern of intentional misrepresentation. That's sufficient for now. I faced Catherine next. I need access to Jason's email exchanges with this TW contact as soon as possible, and full visitor logs for the past year cross-referenced with his private calendar. As the team dispersed to their tasks, I found myself alone in the conference room, surrounded by evidence of Jason's betrayal, not just of me, but of the entire company and its shareholders. The familiar ache of personal hurt had long since transformed into something colder and more focused. Determination to expose the truth, whatever the cost. My phone buzzed with a message from Douglas. Jason requesting a private meeting with you. Says it's in everyone's best interest. Thoughts? I considered the request. Meeting alone with Jason would be risky, but it might also reveal what he was planning. After a moment's reflection, I responded, Conference room C, security outside the door, 15 minutes only. At precisely 3:45 p.m., I entered the small conference room to find Jason already seated, his composure fully restored. The disheveled, angry man from our earlier confrontation had vanished, replaced by the calculated, charming executive I'd been married to for 12 years. Allison. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for meeting. With me. 15 minutes, Jason. I'm on a tight schedule. I remained standing, refusing to be drawn into the false intimacy of sitting across from him. He leaned back, studying me with newfound respect. You know, in all our years together, I never truly appreciated your capabilities. That was my mistake, one of many. I'm not here to reminisce, I replied evenly, refusing to be drawn into personal reminiscence. What did you want to discuss? A mutually beneficial arrangement. He slid a folder across the table. My resignation, effective immediately in exchange for certain accommodations. I opened the folder to find a drafted resignation letter and a proposed separation agreement. The terms were breathtaking in their audacity. Full severance, retention of stock options, indemnification against any financial irregularities discovered during his tenure, and a mutual non-disparagement clause that would effectively prevent the company from disclosing the reasons for his departure. This is delusional, Jason. Is it? His smile widened slightly. Consider the alternatives. A prolonged public battle between ex-spouses at the helm of a major technology company. Accusations of personal vendetta undermining legitimate corporate governance. Shareholder. Lawsuits. Regulatory investigations. Client defections. He shrugged. Vertex's stock would plummet, possibly beyond recovery. You seem to be forgetting the evidence, I reminded him. 5 independent auditors have verified the financial misconduct. This goes beyond any personal history between us. Evidence can be interpreted many ways. His tone remained conversational, almost friendly. Did you know Marcus Blackwell and I have been friends since college? That we vacation together every summer? How do you think Nexus Dynamics will respond when their CEO hears that his old friend is being railroaded by his bitter ex-wife? I maintained my poker face, though internally I was recalculating. Marcus Blackwell controlled nearly a third of our business. If he pulled Nexus's contracts, and the press, Jason continued, noting my silence. They love a scandalous narrative. Scorned wife takes revenge on corporate husband. It practically writes itself. You're overplaying your hand, Jason. I closed the folder and slid it back to him. Your proposal is rejected. His expression hardened. Then you leave me no choice but to protect myself by any means necessary. Is that a threat? A statement of fact? He stood slowly. I've spent 15 years building Vertex Technologies. I won't watch you destroy it over a personal grudge. This isn't about our divorce, Jason. I rose to meet his gaze directly. This is about $90 million in misappropriated funds. This is about falsified compliance reports that put investors at risk. This is about securities fraud that jeopardized thousands of jobs and millions in shareholder value. A flicker of surprise crossed his face at the mention of the specific figure. He hadn't expected me to know the full extent of the Pinnacle Prime operation. You're out of your depth, Allison, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have no idea what you're interfering with, or who else is involved. Some things are bigger than corporate governance or even your quest for personal justice. The implied threat hung in the air between us. For the first time, I sensed real fear beneath Jason's calculated exterior. Not fear of exposure or professional disgrace, but something deeper and more primal. Our 15 minutes are up, I said calmly, moving toward the door. Security will escort you back to your office. The all-hands meeting is still scheduled for 4:30 p.m. I expect you to attend and support the transition publicly. As I reached for the door handle, Jason called after me. Allison? Something in his tone made me pause. We were married for 12 years. I know you think I never loved you, but you're wrong. What I did, the text, The way I ended things. It wasn't about you. I was trying to protect you. I turned back, searching his face for any sign of manipulation or deception. Instead, I found an uncharacteristic vulnerability, almost pleading. Protect me from what, Jason? He seemed to wage an internal battle before responding. From the consequences of knowing too much. Some questions shouldn't be asked. Some stones shouldn't be turned. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress I'd rarely seen from him. Walk away from this investigation, Allison. Take the CEO position, implement your corporate reforms, but close the inquiry into Pinnacle Prime. For your own safety. The sincerity in his warning sent a chill through me. This wasn't the calculated threat of a cornered executive. This was genuine fear for my well-being. Who is TW, Jason? The color drained from his face. How do you? He caught himself. It doesn't matter. Just know that these people operate on a different level. They don't issue warnings or make threats. They simply solve problems. Are you saying your financial fraud is connected to something criminal? Possibly violent? He moved closer, lowering his voice despite the privacy of the room. I'm saying you need to be very careful about what you reveal at today's all-hands meeting. Stick to the leadership transition. Leave Pinnacle Prime alone. If not for your sake, then for the safety of everyone in this building. With that cryptic warning, he straightened his tie and walked past me out of the conference room, nodding politely to the security officers stationed outside. I remained rooted in place, my mind racing to process this new information. Jason's warning seemed genuine, which opened a disturbing possibility. The financial fraud I'd uncovered might be merely a symptom of something far more dangerous. Something that had prompted Jason to abruptly sever all ties with me 3 years ago, even at the cost of our marriage. As I made my way back to the executive floor, I found Catherine waiting outside my office, her expression grim. I found something about TW, she said without preamble. You need to see this immediately. The familiar tightness of anxiety gripped my chest as I followed her inside, shutting the door firmly behind us. Whatever Jason was involved in, I was about to discover just how deep the corruption ran, and perhaps why my husband of 12 years had suddenly decided I was a liability he couldn't afford to keep. TW is Thomas Whitfield, Catherine explained. As she closed my office door behind us, she placed her laptop on my desk and pulled up a series of documents. He's officially listed as a strategic consultant to several companies, including Vertex, but there's almost no public footprint beyond that. I studied the screen, trying to place the name. Should I know him? Probably not. He operates almost entirely in the shadows. Catherine's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up more files. What's concerning is his client list and the pattern of what happens to companies after he gets involved. She displayed a chart showing the trajectories of various corporations. Each of these companies hired Whitfield as a consultant. Within 18 months, each experienced a major restructuring event, acquisition, merger, or bankruptcy. In every case, the original executive leadership was completely replaced. Corporate raider? I suggested. That was my first thought, but it's more complex. She pulled up another screen, this one showing news headlines. These are corporate scandals connected to companies in Whitfield's portfolio: accounting fraud, insider trading, embezzlement. I leaned closer, noting the dates. These all occurred during or immediately after his consultation periods. Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. She opened a new folder containing surveillance photos. These were taken at various industry events over the past 5 years. I've highlighted Whitfield in each one. The images showed a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and penetrating eyes. In every photo, he was engaged in conversation with various executives, including, I felt my breath catch, Jason. They appeared to be on familiar terms, sharing drinks at a charity gala in one image, leaning close in conversation at an industry conference in another. When was the earliest contact between them? I asked. Catherine scrolled to a photo dated 3 years and 2 months ago. This is the first documented meeting I could find. Note the date. I did, and felt a chill run through me. 2 weeks before Jason had ended our marriage with that text. Message. There's more, Catherine continued. I cross-referenced the dates of Whitfield's meetings with Jason against our internal records. Each meeting was followed by a significant decision regarding Vertex's financial practices, establishment of offshore entities, changes in accounting methods, creation of shell companies for asset protection. The implications were becoming clear and far more disturbing than mere financial fraud. He's not just a corporate raider, I said. He's something worse. Catherine nodded grimly. I think so. I dug into the legal aftermath of companies where Whitfield operated. There's a pattern of federal investigations that mysteriously stall, witnesses who recant testimony, evidence that disappears. I sat heavily in my chair, processing this information. Jason's warning suddenly took on new meaning. If Whitfield was orchestrating corporate takeovers on this scale, the financial fraud might be merely a mechanism to hide the real crimes and the real profits. Have you shared this with anyone else? I asked Catherine. No. Given the sensitivity, I thought you should see it first. Good instinct. Keep this between us for now. I checked the time. 4:15 p.m. The all-hands meeting would begin in 15 minutes. Continue your investigation, but use a secure terminal not connected to our main network. And Catherine, be careful. Document everything, but store it offline. After she left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the city skyline as I recalibrated my understanding of what I'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about exposing Jason's financial misconduct or even reclaiming my professional dignity. I was potentially uncovering a criminal enterprise that involved people who, in Jason's words, solved problems. My phone buzzed with a reminder for the all-hands meeting. I gathered my notes, my mind racing with new questions. How much should I reveal to the company today? How could I protect the investigation and my team while still moving forward? As I headed toward the main auditorium where hundreds of employees were gathering, Douglas fell into step beside me. You look like you've seen a ghost, he observed quietly. Something like that. I hesitated, then decided he needed to know at least part of the truth. The situation is more complex than we initially believed. Jason may be involved with dangerous people. Douglas's expression tightened. Dangerous. How? I'm still piecing it together, but I think our focus needs to shift. The financial fraud appears to be covering up something bigger, possibly involving organized corporate takeovers. He absorbed this in silence as we approached the auditorium doors. Should we postpone the meeting? He asked. No, but I'm modifying my remarks. We announced the leadership transition and briefly addressed the financial review, but I won't mention Pinnacle Prime or Thomas Whitfield. Douglas nodded, understanding the gravity of my decision. I'll support whatever you think is best. The auditorium fell silent as we entered. Hundreds of employees watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Jason was already seated in the front row, his expression unreadable. I noticed he had positioned himself next to Marcus Blackwell from Nexus Dynamics, a power play, designed to demonstrate his continued relevance and connections. As I took the stage, I felt the weight of every gaze. These people depended on Vertex for their livelihoods. Many had mortgages, children in college. What I said in the next few minutes would affect them all. Good afternoon, I began, my voice calm and measured despite the turmoil inside. For those who haven't seen the announcement, my name is Allison Carter, and as of this morning, I am the new Chief Executive Officer of Vertex Innovations. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of surprise, confusion, and speculation. I waited for it to subside before continuing. This transition comes at a critical moment for our company. The board has identified significant challenges in our financial governance that require immediate attention. A full audit is underway, and we are committed to complete transparency with regulatory agencies. I caught Jason's eye, noting the slight relaxation in his posture as I avoided mentioning Pinnacle Prime. He thought I was heeding his warning. In the coming weeks, you'll see changes designed to strengthen our corporate governance and ensure our continued success. Some of these changes may be disruptive in the short term, but they are essential for our long-term stability and growth. Addressed the elephant in the room directly. You may have heard rumors about the nature of this transition. Let me be clear, this is not about personalities or past relationships. It is about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. The auditorium remained silent, employees hanging on every word. Jason Mitchell will be transitioning to the role of Vice President of Special Projects, where his institutional knowledge will remain valuable to the company. We appreciate his years of service and look forward to his continued contributions in this new capacity. Jason rose on cue, joining me on stage with a practiced smile that appeared genuine to everyone who didn't know him as well as I did. He shook my hand firmly, playing his part in this carefully choreographed display of corporate unity. "Thank you, Allison," he said, addressing the audience. "Change is always challenging but often necessary. I fully support this transition and look forward to working with Ms. Carter to ensure Vertex's continued success." His performance was flawless, the consummate professional accepting a new corporate reality with grace. Only I could see the calculated warning in his eyes as he added, "Vertex Innovations has always put the welfare of our clients, employees, and investors first. That commitment remains unchanged under this new leadership." The implied message was clear: don't expose what I've been doing, or everyone suffers. As Jason returned to his seat, I concluded the formal portion of the meeting and opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly, reflecting the uncertainty rippling through the company. Will there be layoffs? Is the company in financial trouble? Will this affect our upcoming product launches? Are we being investigated by the SEC? I answered each question, with as much honesty as I could without revealing the true scope of what we'd discovered. Throughout it all, I maintained eye contact with Jason, letting him believe I was complying with his warning while plotting my next move. As the meeting concluded and employees filed out, Marcus Blackwell approached me, Jason hovering nearby. "Impressive. First day," Blackwell remarked, his shrewd eyes assessing me carefully. "Jason speaks highly of your capabilities, though he seems surprised by your appointment." "Change often comes with surprises," I replied diplomatically. "Indeed." Blackwell glanced between Jason and me, clearly sensing the undercurrents. "I look forward to our meeting tomorrow to discuss Nexus's ongoing relationship with Vertex. I assume our special arrangements will continue uninterrupted?" The emphasis on special arrangements sent a warning signal through my mind. Was Nexus involved in the issues we'd uncovered? "We'll discuss all aspects of our partnership tomorrow," I assured him, maintaining a professional smile. Vertex values transparency in all our client relationships. Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes, concern, perhaps, or calculation. Transparency. Yes, a modern virtue, though not always conducive to business efficiency. He nodded politely. "Until tomorrow, then." As he walked away, Jason lingered for a moment. "Smart decision in there," he said quietly. "Keeping things vague. Protects everyone." "I'm still investigating Pinnacle Prime," I informed him, keeping my voice low, "but I'm being methodical about it." A flash of genuine fear crossed his face. "Allison, please. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then help me understand, Jason. Who is Thomas Whitfield really, and what are you involved in?" His face paled at the mention of Whitfield's name. "How did you—" He stopped, composing himself. "Not here. Not now." "My office, 8 p.m., I instructed, after most employees have left. "One chance to explain yourself, Jason." He hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly before walking away, his shoulders tense with what appeared to be genuine dread. As the auditorium emptied, I remained on stage, watching the retreating figures. The day had revealed layers of corruption far beyond what I'd initially suspected. Whatever Jason was involved in extended beyond Vertex Innovations, beyond our broken marriage, beyond simple financial fraud. And if my suspicions were correct, Thomas Whitfield wasn't just a corporate consultant. He was something far more sinister, the kind of man who solved problems permanently. I checked my watch. 5:30 p.m. 2.5 hours until Jason's explanation. Time to prepare for a conversation that might finally reveal the truth behind both our failed marriage and the dark secret at the heart of Vertex Innovations. The hours after the all-hands meeting were filled with methodical preparation. After briefing Douglas on what I'd discovered about Pinnacle Prime, I retreated to my office with strict instructions not to be disturbed except for emergencies. I called Elaine, the lead forensic accountant. I need everything you have on Vertex's acquisition history for the past 5 years. Focus on companies that were struggling financially before we purchased them, especially those with unusual valuation adjustments. That's outside our original scope, she replied hesitantly. I know. The investigation has evolved. I need this information as soon as possible. After ending the call, I contacted a trusted former colleague from my consulting days. Natalie, I need a background check on someone named Thomas Whitfield. Deep dive, off the books, highest discretion. Sounds serious, she remarked. Timeline yesterday if possible, but I'll take whatever you can get me by this evening. The financial evidence against Jason was damning, but I sensed a deeper layer to his corruption, one that went beyond mere profit and into something potentially catastrophic. The more I uncovered Pinnacle Prime, the more disturbed I became. At 7 p.m., Catherine knocked softly at my door. I've got something. She placed a tablet on my desk, displaying communications between shell companies linked to Vertex. These entities aren't just hiding money. They're acquiring controlling interests in companies that compete with our clients. The pattern she revealed was sophisticated and alarming. Vertex would use inflated profits to create shell companies, which would then quietly purchase struggling competitors of our major clients like Nexus Dynamics. Shortly after acquisition, those companies would experience catastrophic data breaches or product failures, effectively removing them as competitive threats. This goes way beyond financial fraud, Catherine said. It looks like corporate sabotage for hire. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing than I'd imagined. Not just financial fraud to boost profits, but a coordinated scheme to eliminate competition for our biggest clients in exchange for lucrative contracts. What's the connection to Westbrook Holdings? I asked. It appears to be the clearinghouse. Money flows from Vertex to Westbrook, then to Pinnacle Prime, which executes the acquisitions. The trail is deliberately complex. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason. We need to talk privately. It's urgent. I stared at the message, considering my options. After his performance at the all-hands meeting, Jason clearly realized he was losing control. This urgent conversation was likely another attempt to manipulate the situation in his favor. But it also presented an opportunity. If I could get Jason to reveal more about Whitfield and Pinnacle Prime, I might uncover the full extent of his corruption before he had time to cover his tracks. I texted back, my office, 8 p.m. Catherine looked concerned. Are you sure that's wise? Meeting him alone? He won't try anything in the company building, I assured her, though I wasn't entirely convinced. But let's take precautions. Activate the security recording in my office and have guards stationed nearby. At 8:00 p.m. precisely, Jason arrived at my door. The polished executive from the board meeting was gone, replaced by a man who appeared haggard and tense. His tie was loosened, his normally immaculate hair disheveled. Thank you for meeting me, he began, closing the door behind him. What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us. I gestured for him to sit. I'm listening. He glanced nervously around the office. Is this room secure? As secure as it needs to be, I replied neutrally. What's this about, Jason? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You need to stop investigating Pinnacle Prime immediately. There are things you don't understand, dangers you haven't considered. Explain. Pinnacle Prime isn't just a shell company for financial fraud. It's part of a network designed to control market competition while maintaining plausible deniability for the corporations involved. He rubbed his face wearily. I didn't create this system, Allison. I inherited it when I became COO. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was cataloging every word, comparing it against the evidence we'd already gathered. Who created it? Thomas Whitfield. He approached Vertex 5 years ago, offering to help manage competitive obstacles for a fee. It seemed like a corporate solution to a corporate problem. And you agreed? I noted, not bothering to hide my disgust. The board agreed, he corrected quickly. I was implementing their directive. Classic Jason, deflecting responsibility while positioning himself as merely following orders. I'd seen this pattern throughout our marriage whenever he made questionable decisions. So why tell me this now? Why the urgent warning? His expression shifted to something that might have passed for concern if I didn't know him so well. Because Whitfield is dangerous, Allison. Not just corporate lawsuit dangerous. Physically dangerous. You expect me to believe you're concerned for my safety? I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. Believe what you want about my motives. His eyes met mine with an intensity that might have been convincing 3 years ago. But Whitfield has a pattern. When people start asking questions about his operation, they tend to have accidents. I studied him carefully, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize during 12 years of marriage. The slight twitch at the corner of his left eye when he was constructing a lie. The calculated way he maintained eye contact a beat too long. Did you know about the corporate sabotage? I asked, deliberately changing direction to throw him off balance. He hesitated, surprise flickering across his face. How did you? Catherine found the pattern, I supplied. The systematic acquisition and destruction of companies competing with our clients. He recovered quickly. That's exactly my point. This goes beyond financial misconduct. There are real legal consequences here. That's why we need to handle this carefully, strategically. We? I repeated coldly. Yes, we. He leaned closer. Look, I know you have every reason to hate me. What I did, ending our marriage the way I did, was unforgivable. But right now, we need to work together to contain this situation before it spirals out of control. I allowed a moment of silence, watching him squirm slightly under my scrutiny. Tell me about our divorce, Jason. The abrupt change of subject caught him off guard. What? Why did you end our marriage with a text message while I was at my father's hospital bedside? After 12 years together, why that method? Why that timing? His expression cycled through several emotions before settling on what appeared to be remorse. It was a mistake. I was under immense pressure. The timing was inexcusable. That's not an explanation. That's an evasion. Let's try again. What was happening 3 years ago that made you end our marriage so abruptly? I already knew the answer. My investigation had uncovered his meetings with Whitfield about their new arrangement. But I wanted to see if he would tell the truth. Jason sighed heavily, a performance of emotional vulnerability that once might have moved me. It was complicated, Allison. The company was at a critical juncture. I was working 18-hour days, making difficult decisions. Still not an answer, I interrupted coldly. One more try, Jason. Why the text? Why while I was watching my father die? Something shifted in his eyes, calculation replacing feigned vulnerability. Would you believe me if I said it was to protect you? No. A humorless smile touched his lips. Smart. You always were. He straightened slightly. The truth is, Whitfield was making it clear that our arrangement would require certain compromises. Personal entanglements became liabilities. He showed me photos of you at your office, at the hospital with your father. He knew your routines, your vulnerabilities. He made it clear that my cooperation will ensure your safety. The audacity of this new lie was breathtaking. I stared at him, genuinely amazed by his ability to construct such a manipulative narrative on the spot. So you're claiming you divorced me to protect me? I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. He nodded earnestly. If we weren't together, if there was a clean break, you wouldn't be associated with whatever happened to me if things went wrong. It was cruel, I know. Unforgivable. But I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. For a moment, I simply observed him. This man I had spent 12 years with, whose lies I had once believed, whose manipulations I had once mistaken for love. In another life, perhaps I might have fallen for this performance. Not anymore. That's quite a story, Jason, I said finally. Creative. Almost touching, if it weren't completely contradicted by your emails to Whitfield discussing how our marriage had become a personal liability to your advancement. His expression froze, then hardened. You don't understand the full context of those communications. I understand enough. I stood, signaling that our meeting was over. Your corporate sabotage will be reported to the appropriate authorities. Your financial fraud has already been documented for the board. Whatever game you're playing with this Whitfield story ends now. He rose as well, desperation replacing the calculated charm. Allison, listen to me. Whatever you think of me, whatever evidence you found, this is bigger than our personal history. Whitfield is real, and he's dangerous. I'll take my chances, I replied coolly. As he moved toward the door, he made one last attempt. The corporate sabotage operations, they're broader than you realize. Whitfield's network has compromised systems at 12 different companies. They can trigger catastrophic failures remotely, make it look like accidents or product defects. I paused, struck by the specificity of these details. This particular information might be true, or it could be another manipulation to scare me into backing off. If you're so concerned about corporate ethics, why didn't you stop it? I challenged myself. I tried to limit the damage, but he stopped himself. You won't believe me no matter what I say, will you? You've given me no reason to, Jason. 12 years of marriage ended with a text message for business advantages. 3 years of financial fraud and corporate sabotage. And now, when you're finally facing consequences, suddenly you're the reluctant participant? The man who sacrificed his marriage to protect his wife? I shook my head. You're right. I don't believe you. He stared at me for a long moment, then his expression shifted to something harder, more calculating. You think you've won, don't you? That you've achieved some sort of justice by taking my position, exposing my actions? This isn't about winning, Jason. It's about accountability. No, he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This is about revenge. You've spent 3 years planning this moment, orchestrating my downfall, but you have no idea what you've stepped into. As he reached for the door handle, my phone buzzed with a message from security. Unknown vehicle, parked near executive entrance for past 30 minutes. 2 men inside watching the building. Police notified. I showed Jason the message. To my surprise, a genuine alarm crossed his face. It's starting already, he muttered. Whitfield's people. They're watching, assessing. Despite my skepticism about his Whitfield story, the security alert was real. Someone was watching the building, and given the scale of corruption I'd uncovered, taking precautions seemed prudent. I'll make my own arrangements, I told him firmly. This conversation is over, Jason. As he left my office, his final words floated back to me. When everything falls apart, Remember, I tried to warn you." I watched him disappear down the corridor, his defeated posture at odds with the calculating gleam I'd seen in his eyes moments before. This wasn't over. Jason Mitchell didn't surrender easily, especially when cornered. My phone rang, Catherine calling from the security office. "I've been monitoring the surveillance feed," she reported. "Jason's heading to the parking garage, but he's made 3 phone calls since leaving your office. We couldn't pick up the audio, but his body language was agitated. Stay on him," I instructed. "And Catherine, don't trust anything he says about Whitfield or Pinnacle Prime. He's manipulating the situation to save himself." "Understood, but Allison—" She hesitated. "The SUV outside. The men have night vision equipment. They're not just watching. They're conducting surveillance. Professional surveillance." A chill ran down my spine despite my determination not to let Jason's warnings affect me. Whether Whitfield was exactly as Jason described, or simply a business associate with security resources, someone was indeed watching Vertex Technologies tonight. I gathered the most critical evidence into my secure briefcase, encrypting digital copies and sending backups to trusted external locations. Whatever game Jason was playing, whether his warnings contained any truth or were purely self-serving, I would be prepared. The revenge I had planned for 3 years was nearly complete. Jason's career was crumbling, his reputation in tatters, his crimes exposed. But as I prepared to leave the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory might come with complications I hadn't anticipated. Not because Jason's warnings were genuine, but because the scope of his corruption extended further than I had initially believed. I left Vertex headquarters through the executive parking garage, taking precautions to ensure I wasn't followed. The mysterious SUV remained in position near the main entrance, but my security team confirmed the rear exit was clear. As I drove toward my downtown apartment, my mind raced through everything I'd learned and everything Jason had tried to make me believe. The corporate sabotage was real. Our investigation had confirmed that much. The targeted destruction of competing companies was well documented through acquisition records and system logs. What remained unclear was whether Jason's warnings about Whitfield contained any truth or were merely a desperate attempt to shift, blame, and create an alliance with me against a fabricated common enemy. I pulled into my building's secure garage and took the private elevator to my penthouse on the 30th floor. Once inside, I activated the security system and called Douglas. "Are you safe?" he asked immediately. "Yes, at home. Doors locked, security active. What's happening at the office?" "Jason left about 20 minutes after you did." The SUV followed. "His car?" He paused. "He seemed to be expecting them, Allison. He didn't act surprised or alarmed when they pulled out behind him." This detail confirmed my suspicions. Because they're not Whitfield's men watching him. They're either private, security he hired to make his story more convincing, or associates helping him maintain the charade. "That was my assessment as well," Douglas agreed. "The timing is too convenient. Just as he's spinning this tale about a dangerous conspirator, mysterious surveillance appears. Classic misdirection." I moved to my home office, powering up my secure laptop. "Have Elaine and the forensic team found anything more about Thomas Whitfield?" "Yes, and it's interesting. He exists, but he's not what Jason described." I heard papers shuffling in the background. "Whitfield is a corporate consultant specializing in competitive intelligence and market strategy. His client list includes several Fortune 500 companies, including Vertex and Nexus Dynamics. But contrary to Jason's claims, Whitfield's recommendations have consistently pushed for legal methods of market advantage, not sabotage or illegal tactics. So Jason twisted a legitimate business relationship into a convenient scapegoat, I concluded. Typical. "What about the corporate sabotage operations?" I asked. "The targeted acquisitions and subsequent failures of companies competing with our clients." "Those are real," Douglas confirmed. "But the timeline aligns perfectly with Jason taking control of acquisition strategy. If anything, Whitfield seems to have objected to these approaches. We found a series of recommendations he submitted urging a return to more traditional market strategies. I processed this information, the final pieces of Jason's deception falling into place. He had completely inverted reality, blamed his own actions on the one person who was advocating against them. "It appears so," Douglas replied. "But Allison—" He hesitated. While Jason's story about Whitfield is clearly fabricated, the corporate sabotage situation is genuine and serious. Preliminary data suggests that at least 3 companies were deliberately targeted for acquisition, then systematically dismantled to benefit Nexus Dynamics. We're looking at potential antitrust violations that could trigger serious legal and ethical implications for Vertex. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of this responsibility settling on my shoulders. My personal mission against Jason had uncovered something far more significant than financial fraud. We need to act immediately, I decided. Contact our legal team. I want a comprehensive audit of all acquisitions in the past 5 years. Arrange for independent security assessments at each subsidiary. And prepare a disclosure strategy for the board meeting tomorrow. The board may resist immediate disclosure, Douglas cautioned. The legal implications are enormous. The ethical implications of inaction are worse, I replied firmly. Jason's corruption stops now, even if it means short-term pain for Vertex. After ending the call, I turned my attention to the evidence we'd gathered, both against Jason and about the corporate sabotage situation. If we moved quickly, we could mitigate the damage to Vertex's reputation while still holding Jason accountable for his actions. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Allison?" Jason's voice was tense, his breathing uneven. "Are you alone?" "What do you want, Jason?" "To warn you one last time. The men in the SUV, they followed me to a restaurant, watched me through the window for an hour, then made a call. 20 minutes later, my car wouldn't start. The mechanic found the brake lines had been cut. I frowned, skepticism warring with caution. And yet you're perfectly fine, calling me from a mysterious number." "Because I was paranoid enough to check my car before driving it," he snapped. "Look, believe what you want about me, about us, about why I ended our marriage. But Whitfield is real and he's dangerous. Thomas Whitfield is a corporate consultant who repeatedly advised Vertex to strengthen ethical business practices you deliberately undermined," I countered. "We've seen his recommendations, Jason. He was advocating against the very actions you took." A moment of silence followed, then a low, humorless laugh. "You think you figured it all out, don't you? The brilliant Allison, always 3 steps ahead." "I've verified the facts, Jason. Something you apparently thought I wouldn't bother to do. The Whitfield you're finding in official records isn't the same man," he insisted. "That's his corporate facade, his legitimate cover. Ask yourself why a respected consultant would continue working with companies that repeatedly ignored his recommendations. Why would he maintain relationships with executives who undermined his protocols?" The question was actually pertinent, but I remained skeptical. Perhaps for the substantial consulting fees. Or perhaps because the consulting relationship provides perfect cover for his other operations. Jason's voice lowered urgently. "The real money isn't in giving competitive intelligence advice, Allison. It's in eliminating problems for corporations permanently." I considered whether to continue engaging with what was likely another manipulation attempt. Against my better judgment, I decided to probe further, if only to understand the extent of Jason's deception. What kind of problems? Competitors who won't sell. Whistleblowers threatening to expose unethical practices. Journalists digging too deep into corporate misconduct. His voice grew more intense. "Have you looked into the pattern of convenient accidents surrounding executives who opposed Whitfield's client companies?" "I had, actually. Our investigation had uncovered several suspicious incidents. but nothing definitively linked to Whitfield himself. If Whitfield is this dangerous, why involve him in the first place? I challenged myself. You could have simply followed ethical business practices, Jason. He laughed bitterly. You think it was my decision? Whitfield's relationship with Vertex predates my promotion to COO. He was brought in by board members with connections to Nexus Dynamics. I inherited the arrangement. And rather than ending it, you expanded it, I noted coldly. The targeted acquisitions increased significantly under your direction. The sabotage operations more than doubled in your first year as COO. He didn't immediately respond, and I pressed the advantage. You're trying to rewrite history, Jason, casting yourself as the reluctant participant rather than the driving force. Just like you're attempting to reframe our divorce as some noble sacrifice rather than what the evidence clearly shows. A calculated business decision made with Whitfield's encouragement. It wasn't that simple, he finally said, his voice strained. Nothing ever is, I replied. Save it for your deposition. The board meeting tomorrow will formalize your termination. The evidence against you is comprehensive and irrefutable. Allison. His voice took on an almost pleading quality. Whatever you think of me, be careful. Watch the board members, especially those with connections to Nexus Dynamics. Don't trust Blackwell. And for God's sake, don't meet with Whitfield if he reaches out. Goodbye, Jason. I ended the call, then immediately contacted Catherine. I need you to verify something. Jason claims someone tampered with his car tonight, specifically cut the brake lines. Can you check if any police report has been filed? About it? She replied 20 minutes later. No police report, but I accessed the restaurant's security camera feeds. Jason did check underneath his car before getting in, and he did have it towed rather than driving it. I can't verify the brake line specifically, but something made him suspicious enough not to drive. Or he staged the whole thing, I suggested. Had someone disconnect something minor to make his story more convincing? Possible, Catherine acknowledged. He certainly had time to arrange it. But Allison... She hesitated. I did find something else while investigating Whitfield. There is a pattern of, convenient accidents surrounding executives who opposed mergers favorable to Whitfield's client companies. Nothing directly tied to him, but the statistical correlation is troubling. I considered this information carefully. Jason could easily have known about these incidents and incorporated them into his fiction to make it more believable. Absolutely, Catherine agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly. I'm just providing all the information. After ending the call, I sat in my darkened apartment, watching the city lights below as I weighed everything I'd learned. Jason's desperation was evident, his manipulations increasingly transparent. Yet some small details, like checking his car before driving it, suggested either a genuine concern for his safety or an elaborate performance designed to convince me of his fabricated Whitfield conspiracy. The simplest explanation was usually the correct one. Jason was creating distractions to avoid responsibility for his actions. The evidence against him was clear and damning. His attempts to shift blame to Whitfield, to reframe our divorce as protection rather than abandonment, to position himself as a reluctant participant rather than an active orchestrator, all pointed to a man frantically trying to escape consequences. Tomorrow's board meeting would formalize his termination and my permanent appointment as CEO. The corporate sabotage investigation would begin immediately, regardless of cost. Jason's corporate empire would crumble, and my 3-year journey toward professional vindication would reach its conclusion. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed one final time. A text from an unknown number, different from the one Jason had, called from earlier. Storage Unit 672, Oakwood Facility. Security code 0823. What you need is inside. Trust no one, not even the board. I stared at the message, weighing whether this was one last desperate attempt at manipulation or something else entirely. Either way, I had no intention of walking into what could easily be a trap. Whatever game Jason was playing, I wouldn't be drawn into it. I set my phone aside and reviewed my notes for tomorrow's board meeting. In less than 12 hours, Jason Mitchell would officially lose everything he valued: his position, his reputation, his carefully constructed facade of corporate respectability. The man who had once dismissed me with a text message would learn that underestimating me had been the most costly mistake of his life. The satisfaction of that knowledge carried me into sleep, despite Jason's warnings and the lingering questions about what might be hidden in storage unit 672. I woke at 5 a.m., a full hour before my alarm was set to go off. Something about Jason's story nagged at me despite my skepticism. The convenience of it all, the elaborate tale of protection, the sudden vulnerability from a man who had never once admitted fault during 12 years of marriage. I replayed our conversation in my mind, focusing not on his words but on his mannerisms, the way his left eye twitched slightly when he mentioned Whitfield's threats, the rehearsed quality of his explanation, the calculated pause before his emotional confession. By the time I stepped into my shower, realization had dawned. Jason Mitchell, master manipulator, corporate tactician, and my ex-husband of 3 years, was lying again. But perhaps not about everything. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy suit that projected both authority and approachability. Today would define not just my future at Vertex, but the company's path forward. As I applied my makeup, I considered the board meeting ahead and the various scenarios that might unfold. Several board members had close ties to Nexus Dynamics, the same members who had originally hired Whitfield as a consultant before Jason's promotion to COO. If Jason's corporate sabotage operations had indeed benefited Nexus, those board members might resist a full investigation. I needed to prepare for potential resistance, perhaps even outright obstruction. As I gathered my briefcase and coat, I decided to make a stop before heading to the office. Oakwood Storage Facility was located in an industrial area just outside the city center. The early morning fog gave the place an eerie, abandoned quality. Though the security was state-of-the-art, keycard access, surveillance cameras, and individual unit alarms. I sat in my car, staring at the entrance. Jason's text message could easily be a trap, a desperate attempt to lure me into a compromising position, or simply a distraction from the day's crucial board meeting. Then again, if there was even a slight chance that Unit 672 contained evidence that could shed light on the true extent of the corruption at Vertex, I needed to see it. But I wouldn't walk in blind. I called Catherine. "I need backup. Oakwood Storage Facility, as soon as possible." "On my way," she replied without hesitation. 20 minutes. Don't go in alone." While I waited, I searched online for any connection between Oakwood Storage and either Jason or Whitfield. Nothing obvious appeared, but I did discover that the facility was owned by a subsidiary of Westlake Properties, a company that shared an address with Westbrook Holdings, one of Jason's shell companies. Catherine arrived in a nondescript sedan, parking beside me. She looked as though she hadn't slept, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "I've been up all night digging into Whitfield," she explained as she got into my car. "There's more to this than we thought. Tell me." I followed the money trail from the sabotaged acquisitions. The funds didn't just disappear into offshore accounts, they were reinvested in a specific pattern. She pulled up a diagram on her tablet. Every company targeted for acquisition and subsequent dismantling had one thing in common. They all held patents potentially valuable to Nexus Dynamics. Jason was acquiring companies for their intellectual property, then sabotaging their operations. To eliminate them as competitors, I concluded. Yes, but here's where it gets interesting. After each company failed, their patents were sold at bargain prices to shell companies that ultimately transferred them to Nexus. The sabotage wasn't just about eliminating competition. It was about acquiring valuable IP without paying market value. A sophisticated scheme, and one that would be enormously valuable to Nexus Dynamics. No wonder Marcus Blackwell was concerned about our special arrangements continuing. And Whitfield's role in all this? I asked. Catherine hesitated. That's where the pattern gets murky. On paper, he advised against these acquisitions, but he also met with Jason before and after each one. And there's this. She showed me another document. Whitfield's consulting firm received substantial payments from a Cayman Islands account linked to Nexus, payments that don't appear in any official records. Double game, I murmured. Public recommendations against the actions, private facilitation of them. Exactly. He maintains a clean public profile while secretly orchestrating the very activities he publicly condemns. She glanced at the storage facility. So what are we looking for here? Jason sent a cryptic text about Unit 672, claims it contains what I need to understand the situation. Could be a trap, Catherine noted. Could be. That's why I called you. I handed her a small case. Body camera. Records to a secure cloud. Server. If anything happens to me, Douglas gets the footage immediately. We approached the entrance, the security panel glowing in the dim morning light. I entered the code from Jason's text, EU823, a date that held significance for us, August 23rd, the day we had met at a college fundraiser 15 years ago. The R panel flashed green, the gate sliding open silently. Not a generic code then, but one specifically chosen for its personal meaning. Only Jason would have selected that particular number. Unit 672 was located in the back corner of the facility, away from the main access road and partially obscured by larger storage units. The door was secured with both a keypad and a padlock. The code again? Catherine suggested. I tried 0823 on the keypad. Nothing happened. Try your birthday, she said. I entered my birth date, 0417. The keypad remained red. What else would be significant to both of you? I thought for a moment, then entered the date of our divorce finalization. 11/29. The light turned green, and the lock clicked open. We exchanged glances. Jason had set this up specifically for me, using dates only I would know to try. Stay behind me, Catherine said, pulling a small canister from her pocket, pepper spray. And keep recording. She pulled the door open slowly, revealing a small, climate-controlled unit. No booby trap, no ambush. Just a simple metal filing cabinet, a laptop computer on a folding table, and a large corkboard covered with documents, photographs, and maps, all connected by red string. The kind of evidence, wall you'd see in a detective movie. What the hell? Catherine whispered as we stepped inside, closing the door behind us. The wall told a story, a complex web of connections between Vertex, Nexus Dynamics, and multiple shell companies. At the center was a photograph of Thomas Whitfield, connected by red strings to images of various executives, including Jason and Marcus Blackwell. But what caught my attention was another section of the board, photographs of me. Outside my apartment building, at my office, having lunch with colleagues, all taken over the past year, all without my knowledge. Jason wasn't lying about everything, Catherine said quietly, examining the surveillance photos. Someone has been watching you. I stared at the surveillance photos, a chill creeping up my spine. The timestamps showed systematic monitoring over months, my daily routines, regular meetings, even my weekly visits to my father's grave. This is professional work, Catherine murmured, examining the photos. High-resolution telephoto shots, strategic angles. Whoever took these knows what they're doing. My attention shifted to a sealed manila envelope pinned to the center of the board, with my name written on it in Jason's distinctive handwriting. I removed it carefully, half expecting some final manipulation, some last-ditch effort to evade responsibility. Inside was a handwritten letter and a USB drive. Allison, the letter began. If you're reading this, you've either followed the breadcrumbs I left or someone gave you this address. Either way, it means things have escalated beyond my control. What I told you about Whitfield wasn't entirely accurate. But it wasn't entirely false either. I continued reading aloud for Catherine's benefit. Whitfield approached me 3 years ago with an opportunity to streamline competitive obstacles for Vertex. The board, particularly members with connections to Nexus, were enthusiastic. Initially refused, but Whitfield made it clear this wasn't a request I could decline. That's when the surveillance began, not just of me, but of you. The night before I sent that text ending our marriage, Whitfield showed me photos of you at your father's hospital. His message was clear. Either I cooperate fully with their plans, sever all personal liabilities, including our marriage, or accidents could happen to people I cared about. I made a calculation that I've regretted every day since. I thought cutting you loose, cruelly, definitively, would remove you from their radar. It worked until you started investigating Vertex's finances. The USB contains everything I've gathered over 3 years: financial trails, meeting recordings, the full architecture of the corporate sabotage operation. I've kept this insurance policy in case things went south. Now it's yours. I'm not asking for forgiveness or understanding. Just be careful. Trust no one on the board with connections to Nexus. And if Whitfield reaches out personally, record everything. Despite all evidence to the contrary, I did love you. Jason. I lowered the letter, the familiar handwriting blurring slightly as I processed its implications. If Jason was telling the truth, a significant if, given his history of manipulation, my painstakingly planned revenge had unwittingly placed me at the center of something far more dangerous than corporate fraud. We need to validate this independently, I said, gesturing to the USB drive. Cross-reference it with what we already know. Catherine nodded, already connecting the drive to her secure laptop. I'll run it through a sandbox environment first. If there's any malware, we'll detect it before accessing the files. While she worked, I examined the evidence wall more closely. One section detailed the sabotage operations we'd already discovered, but with additional information about the people involved. Board member Ellis Parker appeared prominently in several photos with Whitfield at locations nowhere near Vertex offices. Another board member, Vanessa Lang, was photographed receiving what appeared to be a briefcase from Whitfield's assistant at a remote airstrip. Most disturbing were the photos connecting Marcus Blackwell of Nexus Dynamics directly to operations that had destroyed his competitors. In one image, Blackwell and Whitfield were shaking hands in front of the headquarters of TechForge Industries, a company Vertex had acquired and subsequently dismantled after a series of unfortunate data breaches and product failures. The drive is clean, Catherine announced. And there's a lot here. Financial records, recorded conversations, email exchanges. If this is legitimate, it's the kind of evidence that could trigger federal investigations. Can you verify any of it against what we already know? She nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The financial records match our findings but go much deeper, showing the ultimate destination of funds we couldn't trace. And these emails... She turned the screen toward me. These are exchanges between Whitfield and board members Parker and Lang that never appeared in our investigation. I scanned the emails quickly, my stomach tightening at their content. They described not just the existing sabotage operations, but plans to expand them, targeting 5 additional companies in the coming months. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was clear when viewed alongside the financial records and acquisition plans. A notification popped up on Catherine's screen, an alert from the security system we'd implemented at Vertex. "Someone's trying to access your executive files," she said, typing rapidly to investigate. "They're using Jason's old credentials, the ones we deactivated yesterday. Can you see where the access attempt is coming from?" IP traces to Whitfield's consulting firm. Her eyes met mine. They're making their move already. I checked my watch. 7:15 a.m. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., less than 2 hours to process this new information and decide how to proceed. "We need to get this evidence secured," I said, unplugging the USB drive. "Make a copy, Then store the original somewhere safe, not at Vertex or any of our homes. My sister's a federal prosecutor, Catherine offered. I can have her secure it in an evidence lockbox. It would require a warrant to access. Perfect. I began gathering the most crucial documents from the wall. We need leverage walking into that board meeting. The people involved, Parker, Lang, possibly others, will try to shut this down the moment they realize what we've found. As Catherine packed up the laptop, I called Douglas, waking him from sleep. I need an emergency security protocol implemented at Vertex immediately, I said without preamble. Lock down all access to executive files and the acquisition database. Restrict board member access until further notice. On what grounds? He asked, instantly alert. Potential corporate espionage involving board members. I have evidence, but I need time to secure it before the meeting. This is serious, Allison. The board won't take kindly to being locked out of systems. They'll take it less kindly when they discover certain members have been facilitating corporate sabotage for personal gain, I replied. I need you to trust me, Douglas. 2 hours. That's all I'm asking. After a moment's hesitation, he agreed. I'll call it a security drill, standard procedure during leadership transitions. But Allison, if this evidence doesn't materialize, it will. See you at the meeting. As we left the storage unit, securing it behind us, Catherine frowned at her phone. 3 missed calls from an unknown number in the last 10 minutes. Could be Jason trying to reach you, I suggested, or someone who knows we've found the storage unit. She put her phone on silent. We should assume we're being monitored. We took separate cars and indirect routes, Catherine to deliver the USB to her sister, me to my apartment to change and collect additional materials for the board meeting. As I drove, I processed the bewildering shift in my understanding of the past 3 years. If Jason's letter was truthful, his cruelty had been calculated to protect me, a twisted form of sacrificial love that had nevertheless shattered my life. The text message I'd received at my father's hospital bedside hadn't been mere callousness, but a desperate attempt to sever connections that might place me in danger. Or it could be the most elaborate manipulation yet from a man who excelled at shifting blame and evading consequences. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. Jason had been involved in the corporate sabotage. The evidence confirmed that much. His warnings about Whitfield had elements of truth mixed with self-serving distortions. The surveillance photos were real, but their meaning and origin remained unclear. As I approached my apartment building, caution made me drive past rather than pulling into the garage. A black SUV similar to the one from last night was parked. Across the street, 2 men sitting inside. I circled the block once, then twice, confirming my suspicion. They were watching my home. I called Catherine. Change of plans. My apartment is under surveillance. I need a secure location to prepare for the meeting. The Westmont Hotel, she suggested. My sister keeps a permanent suite there for witnesses and protected informants. No one will look for you there. I redirected to the Westmont, a luxury hotel in the financial district. Catherine had already arranged access, and I was escorted to a suite on the 23rd floor by hotel security. Inside, I found a change of clothes waiting, a charcoal suit similar to my usual style but not from my own closet. Catherine had thought of everything. As I changed, my phone buzzed with a text from Douglas. Security protocols implemented. Board. Members Parker and Lang attempted to override. Chairman Sullivan requested an explanation before the meeting. Sullivan? I'd almost forgotten about the board chairman. Walter Sullivan had been largely absent during my investigation and hiring, delegating most of his responsibilities to Douglas as vice chairman due to health issues. If he was suddenly taking an active interest, something had changed. Tell Sullivan. I'll brief him privately before the full board meeting, I texted back. His office, 8:30 a.m. I spent the next hour preparing a modified presentation for the board, one that would strategically reveal enough about the corporate sabotage to gauge reactions without exposing the full extent of what we'd discovered. The directors who showed genuine shock would likely be innocent. Those who remained unnervingly calm would warrant further scrutiny. At 8:15 a.m., Catherine arrived at the suite, looking relieved but tense. "The USB is secure with my sister," she reported. "She's reviewing it personally and says the evidence appears substantial enough for federal charges, securities fraud, corporate espionage, potentially even racketeering." "That's our insurance policy," I noted. "But first, we need to handle the board." "There's something else," Catherine said, handing me her tablet. "I've been monitoring communications between board members since we left the storage unit. There's been an unusual flurry of messages between Parker, Lang, and Blackwell at Nexus. They're concerned about containment and narrative control. They know something's happening, but not exactly what," I concluded. "Good. Uncertainty will make them nervous, more likely to make mistakes." At 8:25 a.m., we left the hotel through a service entrance, taking Catherine's car to Vertex. The morning bustle of downtown provided excellent cover as we approached the building from a side entrance normally used for deliveries. "Ms. Carter," the security guard said, looking surprised to see the CEO at the loading dock. "Is everything all right?" "Just testing our security protocols, Carl," I replied smoothly. "How's your daughter's softball team doing?" He beamed at the yaw. Personal touch. "State championships next week, ma'am." "Wonderful. I'd appreciate your discretion about our arrival route today." "Of course, ma'am." Catherine and I took the service elevator directly to the executive floor, bypassing the main lobby where we might be observed. As the doors opened, Melissa was waiting, looking anxious. "Mr. Sullivan is in his office," she whispered. "Board members Parker and Lang arrived early, demanding to see him. They've been in there for 15 minutes. "Thank you, Melissa." "Is everything else prepared for the meeting?" "Yes, ma'am. The confidential folders are on your desk as requested." I nodded my thanks and headed toward Sullivan's office, Catherine falling into step beside me. "I should go alone," I told her. "Monitor communications during the meeting. If anything unusual happens, alert Douglas immediately." She nodded, squeezing my arm briefly before heading to her office. The gesture of solidarity meant more than she could know. 3 years ago, I had faced Jason's betrayal alone. Today, I had allies I could trust. I knocked once on Sullivan's door before entering. The chairman sat behind his desk, looking frailer than I remembered from our previous virtual meetings. At 72, Walter Sullivan was the elder statesman of Vertex, a founding investor whose reputation for integrity had helped build the company's sterling public image. Flanking him were Ellis Parker and Vanessa Lang, both looking distinctly uncomfortable at my arrival. "Allison," Sullivan greeted me, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "These directors have raised concerns about your actions this morning. Something about security protocols interfering with their access." "Yes, I authorized those measures," I confirmed, part of a comprehensive security review following some troubling discoveries. "What discoveries?" Lang demanded, her carefully maintained composure slipping slightly. I studied her for a moment. The board's financial expert, a former Wall Street executive with connections throughout the industry. In the photos from the storage unit, she had appeared particularly comfortable with Whitfield. "That's what I came to discuss with Chairman Sullivan," I replied calmly. "Privately, before presenting to the full board." "Anything you can say to Walter, you can say to us," Parker insisted. "We're senior directors with oversight responsibilities." "Indeed you are," I agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "Which makes your involvement with Thomas Whitfield's corporate sabotage operations particularly troubling from a governance perspective." The room went silent. Sullivan looked confused, glancing between us. Parker's face remained carefully blank, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Lang's composure cracked completely, her eyes widening in alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly. "No?" I placed my tablet on Sullivan's desk, displaying a photograph of Lang accepting the briefcase at the airstrip. This was taken 6 months ago, shortly after Vertex acquired DataSync Technologies, a direct competitor to Nexus Dynamics. Within weeks of this meeting, DataSync experienced catastrophic server failures that destroyed their proprietary algorithms and client database. Sullivan picked up the tablet, studying the image with growing concern. Vanessa? She swallowed hard. This is being taken completely out of context. Perhaps, I acknowledged. And perhaps the full board should see all the evidence and decide for themselves, including the recorded conversations between you, Director Parker, and Mr. Whitfield discussing how to neutralize TechForge Industries after acquisition. Parker stood abruptly. This meeting is inappropriate without legal counsel present. I move to postpone the board meeting until proper representation can be arranged. Trying to buy time, Director Parker? I asked quietly. Time to contact Whitfield? Or perhaps Marcus Blackwell at Nexus? Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Ms. Carter. Actually, I believe I do. Corporate sabotage, securities fraud, systematic destruction of acquired companies to benefit Nexus Dynamics, and a very profitable arrangement for board members willing to facilitate the scheme. Sullivan set down the tablet, his expression hardening from confusion to anger. These are extremely serious allegations, Allison. They are, and they're supported by substantial evidence, which will be presented to the full board in, I checked my watch, 18 minutes. The question now is whether Directors Parker and Lang wish to offer their resignations before that presentation, or after their complicity is made public to the entire board. Lang's composure broke completely. It didn't start like this. It was supposed to be strategic acquisitions, competitive intelligence, normal business practices. Vanessa, Parker snapped, but the damage was done. When did it change? I pressed, focusing on Lang while she was vulnerable. When did you realize these weren't normal business practices? She glanced at Parker, then back to me. When TechForge's data center was sabotaged, that wasn't supposed to happen. We were told it would be a simple acquisition, streamlining overlapping products. But then people lost their jobs, their work destroyed. And the patents somehow ended up at Nexus. Sullivan looked physically ill. Is this true, Ellis? Parker's cold facade finally cracked, replaced by calculated pragmatism. Walter, the business world has changed. These weren't crimes. They were aggressive competitive maneuvers. Every major tech company employs similar strategies. Not at Vertex, Sullivan said firmly. Not while I'm chairman. Parker's expression shifted, something like pity crossing his features. That's precisely the problem, Walter. Your outdated ethics have been holding this company back for years. The board has been working around you, making the necessary adjustments to remain competitive. By destroying other companies? I challenged myself. By sabotaging their operations after acquisition? By eliminating redundancy and maximizing value, Parker countered smoothly. The methods may have been unorthodox, but the results speak for themselves. Vertex's market position has never been stronger, and your personal offshore accounts have never been fuller, I added. The $5 million transferred to your Cayman Islands holding company after each successful integration wasn't corporate efficiency, Director Parker. It was a bribe. His face paled slightly. You can't prove that. I smiled coldly. Actually, I can. And in about 15 minutes, so will the rest of the board and the SEC investigators waiting to join our meeting. Sullivan stood slowly, leaning on his desk for support. Ellis, Vanessa, I'm requesting your immediate resignation from this board. If you comply now, the company may consider not pursuing criminal charges, depending on your full cooperation with investigators. Parker stared at him incredulously. You're making a terrible mistake, Walter. There are powerful people involved in these arrangements, people who don't respond well to threats or exposure. Is that what happened to Jason? I asked quietly. Did he threaten to expose the operation? A flicker of something, confirmation perhaps, crossed Parker's face before he controlled his expression. Jason Mitchell made his own choices, as we all do. He straightened his tie and moved toward the door. I'll have my resignation on your desk within the hour, Walter. But don't imagine this ends here. Some forces, once set in motion, can't be easily stopped. Lang followed him silently, her earlier panic now replaced by grim resignation. As the door closed behind them, Sullivan sank back into his chair, looking every one of his 72 years. How long have you known about this? Allison? About the corporate sabotage? Since yesterday. About the board members' involvement? Since this morning. I took the seat across from him. There's more, Walter. Much more. And we have less than 15 minutes to decide how to present it to the board without causing a market panic. He nodded gravely. Then we'd better get to work. Vertex has survived challenges before. We'll weather this one too. But as I outlined the extent of the corruption we'd uncovered, I couldn't help wondering if Parker's parting warning had been more than just the threat of a disgraced executive. What forces had been set in motion? And more importantly, could they truly be stopped? 1 year later, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the morning sun illuminate the city skyline. So much had changed since that fateful board meeting 12 months ago, a day that had begun with confronting corrupt board members and ended with federal agents leading Thomas Whitfield away in handcuffs. The past year had been a whirlwind of federal investigations, corporate restructuring, and rebuilding Vertex's reputation from the ground up. The scandal had initially sent our stock plummeting, but our commitment to transparency and ethical reform had gradually restored investor confidence. We were stronger now, more resilient, and guided by values that went beyond mere profit. My phone buzzed with a message from Catherine, now our chief security officer. Don't forget, 60 Minutes interview at 2:00 p.m. They'll want to discuss the anniversary. I smiled at the reminder. The business press had dubbed our corporate transformation the Vertex Revolution, an unprecedented example of ethical reform in the tech industry. The story of how we had uncovered and dismantled a corporate sabotage ring had captivated the public imagination, becoming a case study in business schools across the country. A soft knock at my door pulled me from my reflection. Melissa entered with a tablet displaying the morning's headlines. Vertex Innovations reports record growth 1 year after corporate scandal. Former board member Ellis Parker sentenced to 12 years for corporate espionage. And CEO Allison Carter named among most influential business leaders of the year. The communications team needs your approval on the statement regarding Mr. Parker's sentencing, Melissa said. I scanned the draft statement we had prepared, a careful balance of acknowledging justice being served while focusing on Vertex's path forward. After yesterday's verdict, Parker had become the fourth and final board member to be convicted for their role in the corporate sabotage scheme. Approved, I said, signing the digital document. And the quarterly reports for the board meeting? Already distributed. Chairman Sullivan asked if you could join him for lunch before the meeting. He said it's not business, just a personal chat. I checked my schedule. Tell him I'll meet him at Morton's at noon. As Melissa left, my gaze fell on a framed news article. On my credential, the Wall Street Journal's coverage of Thomas Whitfield's arrest and the unraveling of his elaborate network of corporate manipulation. The investigation had revealed Whitfield's consulting operation for what it truly was. A sophisticated corporate espionage and sabotage enterprise serving clients willing to pay premium prices to eliminate competition through illegal means. Nexus. Dynamics had been his most lucrative client, with Marcus Blackwell personally authorizing payments of over $75 million for Whitfield's special services over 5 years. Both men were now serving lengthy prison sentences, their empires dismantled. But it was another frame that drew my attention. a simple silver frame containing a handwritten note I had received 6 months ago from a federal prison in Colorado. Allison, I heard about the Innovation Awards and Vertex's comeback. Not surprised. You were always the stronger one, the better one. I know nothing I say can undo the damage I've caused, but for whatever it's worth, I'm glad you found the storage unit. I'm glad the truth came out. Take care of yourself. Jason's case had been complex. While clearly involved in the corporate sabotage operations, evidence from Whitfield's files had corroborated parts of Jason's claim. He had indeed been pressured and threatened. Security footage recovered from Whitfield's office showed a heated confrontation where Whitfield had displayed surveillance photos of me at my father's hospital, making thinly veiled threats. None of that excused Jason's actions in the years that followed, the choices he'd made to participate in and expand the sabotage operations. But it had been enough to secure a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against Whitfield, Blackwell, and the board members involved. 10 years instead of 30. A significant victory for his defense team, though still a steep price to pay. I hadn't responded to his note. Some wounds had healed, but others had merely scarred over. Understanding the context of his betrayal didn't erase the pain it had caused, or the years I had spent rebuilding my life from the ashes of our marriage. My phone rang. Douglas Warner, now my trusted COO. The SEC just signed off on our compliance report, he announced without preamble. They're officially ending their monitoring program 3 months early. Their statement calls Vertex a model of corporate rehabilitation and ethical transformation. That's excellent news, I replied. The board will be pleased. It's more than excellent, Allison, Douglas said, his voice warm with pride. It's unprecedented. No company has ever emerged from this type of scandal stronger than before. What you've built here, what we've all built together, it's changing how the entire industry operates. After we finished discussing the implications, I returned to the quarterly reports, reviewing the numbers one last time before the board meeting. Vertex's focus had shifted dramatically under my leadership. We'd divested from the questionable acquisitions made during Jason's tenure and redirected our resources toward internal innovation and ethical growth. The transformation hadn't been easy. We'd lost contracts, including Nexus Dynamics' lucrative business. We'd faced skepticism from investors and brutal media scrutiny. There had been lawsuits from shareholders, investigations by multiple federal agencies, and the constant challenge of rebuilding trust both internally and externally. But we'd persevered, guided by a simple principle I'd established on my first day as permanent CEO. We will do what's right, not what's expedient. At noon, I met Walter Sullivan at Morton's Steakhouse, his favorite restaurant for our occasional lunches. At 73, Walter remained sharp as ever, though he had scaled back his responsibilities, focusing on mentorship and governance while I handled day-to-day operations. There she is, he greeted me warmly, rising from the table with the help of his cane. The woman who saved Vertex, I embraced him gently. We saved it together, Walter. Nonsense. He waved away my modesty as we sat. I was asleep at the wheel while Parker and his cronies corrupted my company. You were the one who had the courage to expose it all, despite the personal cost. The waiter brought Walter's usual scotch and my sparkling water, taking our lunch orders efficiently. I didn't ask you here to discuss business, Walter said once we were alone again. But I did want to talk about the future. Your retirement rumors again? I asked, smiling. Walter had been threatening to retire for months, though we all knew he would likely remain chairman until physically unable to continue. Not just mine, he replied, his expression turning serious. I've been watching you this past year, Allison. You've accomplished everything you set out to do at Vertex. The company is thriving. The corruption has been exposed. Justice has been served. But I've noticed something these past few months. What's that? You're restless, he said simply. You've won the battle, righted the wrongs, but now you're looking for the next mountain to climb. I recognize it because I felt the same way after my first major success. I considered his observation, surprised by its accuracy. Despite Vertex's remarkable turnaround and my professional vindication, I had been feeling increasingly restless. The challenges that had once consumed me were now routine. The mission that had driven me for years had been accomplished. Maybe you're right, I admitted. But Vertex still needs leadership through this transition period. Vertex will always need leadership, Walter countered. But that doesn't mean it has to be you forever. You've built an exceptional executive team. Douglas is more than capable of stepping up as CEO when you're ready. Ready for what? I asked, genuinely curious where he was heading with this conversation. Walter smiled, a conspiratorial twinkle in his eye. That's what I wanted to discuss. I've been approached by some former colleagues at the SEC and Justice Department. They're forming a task force focused on corporate governance reform and business ethics, creating new frameworks to prevent exactly the kind of corruption we experienced at Vertex. Sounds worthwhile, I noted, taking a sip of my water. They need leadership, someone with first-hand experience battling corporate corruption from the inside. Someone who's demonstrated both the courage to expose wrongdoing and the vision to rebuild afterward. He leaned forward. They want you, Allison. Blinked in surprise. Me? To lead a government task force? Not just any task force. This would be presidential level, with authority to draft new regulations and enforcement mechanisms across industries. Your experience at Vertex would be invaluable. I'm flattered, but I'm not a politician or a regulator. I'm a business leader. Which is precisely why you're perfect for this role, Walter insisted. Too often, these initiatives are led by career bureaucrats who've never run a business. You understand both sides, the practical realities of corporate leadership and the ethical imperatives of good governance. The idea was intriguing, I had to admit. A chance to translate the lessons from Vertex's transformation into broader systemic change. A new challenge that would build on everything I'd learned while pushing me in new directions. When would they need an answer? I asked. They're announcing the initiative next month. But Allison, this isn't about their timeline. It's about yours. He reached across the table to pat my hand. You came to Vertex on a mission of personal justice. That mission has been accomplished. Now it's time to decide what your next chapter looks like. As our lunch progressed, Walter shared more details about the proposed task force and the impact it could have on corporate America. By the time we returned to Vertex for the board meeting, my mind was buzzing with possibilities. The meeting itself was straightforward, reviewing the quarterly results, approving the statement on Parker's sentencing, and discussing upcoming strategic initiatives. But throughout the proceedings, I found myself observing the boardroom with new eyes, seeing not just where we were, but how far we had come. The corrupt board members were gone, replaced by diverse ethical leaders committed to Vertex's new direction. The company culture had transformed from one of cutthroat competition to collaborative innovation. We were profitable not despite our ethical stance, but because of it, our reputation for integrity attracting top talent and loyal customers. My revenge against Jason had evolved into something far more meaningful than I could have imagined 3 years ago. What had begun as a personal mission to expose one man's betrayal had become a catalyst for systemic change. After the meeting, I returned to my office to prepare for the 60 Minutes interview. As I reviewed the talking points, my gaze drifted again to Jason's note in the silver frame. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to hate him anymore. The man who had once broken my heart with a text message was now a footnote in my life story, not its defining chapter. Understanding the context of his betrayal hadn't justified it, but it had allowed me to release the anger that had once fueled my every action. The federal prosecutor who had handled Jason's case had shared something during our last meeting that still resonated with me. In all my interviews with him, she had said, The only time I saw genuine remorse was when he spoke about hurting you. Not the corporate crimes, not the financial fraud, those he rationalized, but the way he ended. Your marriage? That haunts him. It was strange to think that the text message that had once shattered my world had ultimately led me here. To professional heights I might never have achieved otherwise, to strength I never knew I possessed. At 1:30 p.m., Catherine arrived to Daborsti, escort the 60 Minutes crew to the conference room we'd prepared for the interview. They want to focus on the transformation story, she advised as we walked. But they'll likely ask about Jason too. The personal angle still fascinates people. That's fine, I replied. It's part of the story. You seem different today, Catherine observed. More resolved, I smiled. I had an interesting lunch with Walter. He's presented me with a potential new opportunity, one that might take me beyond Vertex. Her eyebrows rose. You're not leaving us, are you? Not immediately, I assured her, but I'm starting to think about what's next. The mission that brought me here has been accomplished. Maybe it's time to take the lessons we've learned and apply them more broadly. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. You know, when you first arrived as CEO, I thought your motivation was purely personal, revenge against Jason. I couldn't have imagined how much larger it would become. Neither could I admitted. Revenge brought me to Vertex, but something more important kept me here. Justice, she suggested. Purpose, I corrected. The realization that what happened between Jason and me wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was symptomatic of a broader ethical failure. Addressing that failure became more important than punishing one person. We reached the conference room, where the interview crew was setting up lights and cameras. Before entering, I paused for a moment of reflection. 3 years ago, standing at my father's hospital bedside, I had received a text message that shattered 12 years of marriage in 14 words. The pain of that moment had fueled a determination that carried me to heights Jason had never believed I could reach. Now that determination had transformed into a purpose that had nothing to do with Jason at all. The woman who had once defined herself by her marriage and its painful ending now stood on her own foundation, recognized for her leadership, integrity, and vision. As I prepared to tell Vertex's transformation story to millions of viewers, I realized that my own transformation had been equally profound. The text message that had once broken my heart had ultimately set me free, not just from a marriage built on manipulation and lies, but from the need to define my worth through another person's eyes. Jason Mitchell had ended our marriage with a text message because I no longer served his ambitions. In doing so, he had inadvertently set me on a path to discover strengths I never knew I possessed, to achieve success beyond what either of us had imagined possible, and ultimately, to outgrow the very need to prove him wrong. The bitter text message that had once broken my spirit had become merely a footnote in a much larger story, my story, that was still being written, one achievement at a time. 6 months later, I stood on a different stage. The White House rose. Garden. The president had just announced my appointment as chair of the new Corporate Accountability and Ethics Commission, a role that would allow me to shape business practices nationwide. As cameras flashed and reporters called questions, I caught sight of Walter Sullivan in the audience, beaming with grandfatherly pride. Beside him sat Catherine, Douglas, and other key members of the Vertex team who had supported my journey. My prepared remarks were brief but heartfelt, focusing on the opportunity to create meaningful change in how American businesses operate. I spoke about integrity, transparency, and the responsibility that comes with corporate power. What I didn't mention, what remained personal, was how this moment connected back to a text message received in a hospital corridor 3 years ago. How sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become unexpected catalysts for our greatest achievements. How revenge, pursued long enough, can transform into something nobler and more enduring. As I concluded my speech to enthusiastic applause, a reporter called out, "Ms. Carter, Do you have any comment on Jason Mitchell's upcoming parole hearing? The question momentarily caught me off guard. I hadn't realized Jason was already eligible for parole consideration. I wish Mr. Mitchell well, I replied after a brief pause. His actions at Vertex were part of a larger system of corruption that we've worked hard to dismantle. My focus now is on preventing similar situations at other companies, not on individual cases from the past. The answer satisfied the press corps, and the event continued. But later, alone in my hotel suite, I found myself reflecting on how genuinely I had meant those words. I truly did wish Jason well, not out of lingering affection or forgiveness, but because his significance in my life had diminished to the point where I could view him with detached compassion rather than emotional investment. The revenge I had once sought had been achieved and transcended. The wounds that had driven me had healed into wisdom. The text message that had once defined my darkest moment had ultimately led to my finest hours. As I prepared for my first official day leading the commission, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't Jason's imprisonment or my professional success, or even the transformation of Vertex Innovations. The ultimate triumph was my complete liberation from the need for revenge itself, the freedom to build something meaningful that had nothing to do with the pain of the past. The journey that had begun with a devastating text message had led me here. Not to the end of a story of revenge, but to the beginning of a legacy of purpose. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.